The rumbling of heavy machinery shattered the stillness of the morning, jolting me awake. At first, I thought it was just a passing truck, but then I heard the unmistakable crunch of wood splitting under metal. I leaped from my bed, heart pounding, and sprinted to the front window. What I saw made my stomach drop. A bulldozer, an actual bulldozer, was tearing apart the wooden ramp in front of my sister's house. Sawdust and splintered planks scattered like shrapnel as the massive machine continued its ruthless destruction. Workers in orange vests stood around, some watching, some directing, as if they weren't actively demolishing something vital. My breath came fast and shallow. I fumbled with the lock and yanked the door open, my bare feet slapping against the pavement as I ran. They had no idea what they had just done. The ramp wasn't just some structure my sister had built for convenience. It was her independence, her lifeline. Emily had been in a wheelchair since the accident 5 years ago. The ramp was the only way she could leave the house on her own. And now, the HOA, those self-important rule-wielding bureaucrats, had taken it upon themselves to destroy it. Without warning. Without permission. I could already picture the smug face of Carl, the HOA president, standing behind this decision. He had always looked at our house like it was a blemish on his pristine neighborhood, a place where things weren't uniform, where someone dared to exist outside the rules he clung to like scripture. I skidded to a stop just as the bulldozer roared back to life. "Hey! Stop!" My voice was sharp, cutting through the noise. The driver turned, looking surprised, but he didn't stop. I ran closer, my fists clenched. I said stop. One of the workers, a stocky man with a clipboard, stepped forward. "Sir, this is an HOA-sanctioned removal. Your structure was built without proper approval." I could feel the heat rising to my face. Approval? This is my sister's ramp. She needs this to get in and out of her house. The man barely blinked. The HOA guidelines state that all exterior structures must match the aesthetic of the community and adhere to pre-approved designs. This ramp, he gestured at the crumbling remains, was not on the list. I didn't even realize my hands were shaking until I clenched them harder. "So you just decided to tear it down? Without notifying us? Without giving us a chance to appeal?" "The HOA sent notices," the man replied, unfazed. "No, they didn't. I knew they hadn't. I opened our mailbox every day, and there was nothing, no warning, no request to modify, nothing. They had done this behind our backs, and they thought they could get away with it." I turned, scanning the houses around us. The neighbors were watching, peeking from behind curtains, standing on their porches, whispering among themselves. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked indifferent. But none of them did anything. A car pulled up fast, tires screeching slightly as it stopped. Emily. She had gone to her morning physical therapy session, and now she was back, just in time to witness what they had done. The door flew open, and she wheeled herself out, her sharp eyes locking onto the scene. I saw the moment she registered the destruction, the tightening of her jaw, the way her fingers curled around her wheels. They had no idea who they were messing with. Emily wasn't just anyone. Before the accident, she had been a lawyer, a damn good one. And if there was one thing she knew how to do, it was fight. The HOA thought they had the upper hand, but they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. She rolled forward, her voice cold and controlled. "Who authorized this?" The clipboard guy hesitated for just a second. "This was an HOA-sanctioned removal, ma'am." Emily's eyes darkened. "So you're telling me that a private organization decided they had the right to demolish property that does not belong to them? Without the owner's consent? Without legal due process?" The man shifted uncomfortably. He had dealt with angry homeowners before, but Emily wasn't just angry, she was calculating. She pointed at the bulldozer. "Get it off my property. Now." The workers glanced at each other, then at the clipboard guy. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am, the HOA. You have exactly 10 seconds to move that thing before I call the police and report this as criminal destruction of property." Silence. Then, the driver of the bulldozer hesitated before shutting off the engine. The workers stood frozen, waiting for a directive. I saw Carl then, standing smugly across the street with his arms crossed, watching. He wasn't worried. He thought he had already won. Emily turned her chair toward him, and I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Because the moment her eyes met his, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Emily sat motionless for a moment, her fingers tightening around the wheels of her chair. The wreckage of her ramp lay in front of her, the broken wood scattered like bones on the pavement. She exhaled slowly, controlled, but I knew her well enough to recognize the storm brewing behind her eyes. Without a word, she turned her chair and rolled back toward the house, her movements smooth, deliberate. I followed her inside, still seething, my pulse pounding in my ears. The second the door closed behind us, she reached for her laptop and powered it on. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, her face illuminated by the screen's glow. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching as she pulled up files, scanned legal documents, and cross-referenced property laws. She didn't ask me to explain what had happened, she didn't need to. She had seen enough, and that was all it took. I knew the HOA was powerful, that they had lawyers on retainer and an entire network of rules that gave them leverage over homeowners, but Emily was different. She didn't just know the law, she understood how to use it, how to wield it like a weapon. She had built her career on dismantling cases just like this, taking apart flimsy arguments and exposing the cracks in policies that people assumed were airtight. This wasn't just about her ramp anymore, it was about the principle of it, about the arrogance of an organization that thought it could bully its way into controlling what didn't belong to it. She clicked through files, downloading legal codes, pulling up records from the county's public database. The more she read, the harder her expression became. I paced the room, restless. "What are we looking at?" I asked, my voice clipped. She didn't look up. "They're overstepping their authority," she said, her tone cold, analytical. "They have no legal right to remove personal property without due process. I need to check their bylaws." She pulled up the HOA's public documents, scrolling through pages of dense legal jargon. My stomach twisted as I watched her scan line after line, her sharp gaze dissecting the clauses. She paused suddenly, and I saw it, the flicker of recognition, the moment she found what she was looking for. She tapped the screen, her lips curling into a smirk. "There," she said, eyes locked on the text. "They violated their own rules." The words sent a jolt of satisfaction through me. They had spent years hiding behind policies, throwing around violations like weapons, but they had just made their first mistake. Emily leaned back, her mind already moving 3 steps ahead. "They're going to try to cover this up," she said, her voice even. "They'll claim they sent notices, that we ignored them. We need proof." I nodded, already reaching for my phone. I scrolled through my emails, my mailbox records, anything that could prove we had never received a warning. It didn't take long. There was nothing, no emails, no letters, nothing but silence until today's destruction. "They never notified us," I confirmed. Emily's fingers drummed against the desk. "Then we go on the offensive." She spent the next hour drafting a formal complaint, citing every legal breach the HOA had committed. She structured the argument perfectly, building a case that would be impossible to ignore. As I read over her shoulder, I felt a surge of pride. This was what she did best. She didn't just fight, she dismantled her enemies piece by piece, exposing their weaknesses until they had no choice but to retreat. By the time she finished, she had not only prepared a legal notice but had also compiled a report detailing similar cases where HOAs had overstepped their boundaries and lost in court. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was preparing to set a precedent. The next step was making sure the HOA knew they had picked the wrong fight. Emily printed out the documents, organized them neatly into folders, and handed one to me. "Drop this off at their office," she said. I took it without hesitation, already grabbing my keys. As I stepped outside, I saw Carl still lingering across the street, his arms crossed, his face smug. He had no idea what was coming. I drove straight to the HOA office, my grip tightening on the folder as I walked through the glass doors. The receptionist barely looked up as I approached. "I need to speak to someone about a formal complaint," I said, my voice level. She gave me a practiced smile. "You can submit your concerns in writing, and the board will review them." I placed the folder on the counter. "They're going to want to review this sooner rather than later." She hesitated, her gaze flickering to the documents. Something in my expression must have made her nervous because she took them without argument and disappeared into the back office. I stood there, waiting, my pulse steady. A few minutes later, a man in a suit appeared, his face carefully neutral. "Sir, we'll review your complaint and be in touch." I met his gaze, holding it. "You might want to do that quickly. You're already in violation of property laws, and my sister's legal team is preparing to escalate this if necessary." The faintest crease formed between his brows. He knew exactly what that meant. As I left the office, I knew the real fight was about to begin. Emily had set the trap, and the HOA was walking straight into it. The next few days would determine everything. If they thought they could intimidate us into backing down, they were in for a rude awakening. The HOA had made the first move, but Emily had just played her opening hand. And knowing her, she was only getting started. The next few days were a waiting game, but Emily was anything but idle. She had already anticipated their response, knowing they would try to dismiss the complaint, downplay their mistake, or, worst of all, dig their heels in deeper. The HOA wasn't just an organization, it was a system built on control, a web of self-importance, where people like Carl thrived on power that was never theirs to begin with. They would not admit they were wrong unless they were forced to, and Emily was more than ready to do exactly that. She had already begun gathering witness statements from neighbors, even the ones too afraid to speak up at first. It was surprising how quickly people turned and they realized they weren't alone. A few brave ones admitted they had been coerced into compliance over the years, forced to tear down harmless additions to their homes, threatened with lawsuits they didn't have the time or money to fight. The HOA operated on fear, and for too long, it had worked. But fear only lasted as long as people believed they had no choice. Emily was here to remind them otherwise. Carl must have sensed something shifting because the first official response from the HOA arrived 2 days later, a letter stamped with their usual red ink and legal jargon meant to intimidate. Emily skimmed through it, barely pausing before tossing it onto the table. As expected, they denied any wrongdoing, claiming they had followed proper procedures and that any further dispute should be addressed through their appeals process, a process that, conveniently, they controlled. It was exactly what she had expected, a weak attempt to delay the inevitable. They thought she would go through their bureaucratic maze, filling out forms, attending meetings, waiting for an answer that would never be in her favor. They didn't understand that she had already moved beyond that stage. She was 3 steps ahead. Without hesitation, she sent an official letter of intent, a legal document outlining their violations in detail and warning of the impending lawsuit should they fail to rectify their actions. She copied the county property board, the local news stations, and a disability rights organization that had taken interest in the case the moment she reached out. If the HOA wanted a quiet battle, they were about to get the opposite. The moment the letters went out, the tension in the neighborhood shifted. People who had once avoided us were now watching with cautious curiosity. The ones who had their own grievances started whispering among themselves, debating whether it was time to come forward. The first crack in the HOA's armor had formed, and Emily was about to widen it. Carl's response was immediate and predictable. He showed up on our doorstep the next morning, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement like he was walking into a courtroom instead of someone's home. He had the same self-important air he always carried, chin lifted, an artificial patience stretched across his face. Emily didn't waste time. She let him talk, let him spout whatever nonsense he had come prepared with about regulations and standards, about how the HOA was just trying to maintain the integrity of the neighborhood. She didn't argue. She didn't interrupt. She just let him talk himself into a corner. Then, when he finally paused, expecting her to back down, she handed him a copy of the legal document. His smirk faltered for just a second as he scanned the pages, his eyes narrowing as he realized exactly what he was holding. The confidence he had walked in with drained from his expression, replaced by something colder, something cautious. He knew what this meant. He knew that Emily wasn't bluffing. The HOA had gotten away with overreach before, had bullied people into submission, but they had never faced someone who knew the law better than they did. Someone who had the resources, the connections, and the absolute determination to see this through. His fingers tightened around the papers, his jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. He simply nodded once, stiff and forced, before turning on his heel and walking away. He wasn't done fighting, but now he understood that neither were we. The escalation came faster than I expected. Within 24 hours, the HOA had sent another letter, this time laced with legal threats of their own. They accused Emily of defamation, of stirring unrest in the community, of inciting hostility against the board. It was an obvious attempt at intimidation, but Emily didn't even flinch. She was already preparing her next move. This wasn't just about the ramp anymore. This was about proving that the HOA had no real authority beyond what people allowed them to have. They weren't a government. They weren't a law enforcement agency. They were a group of homeowners who had convinced themselves they were something more. And the moment people stopped believing in that illusion, their power crumbled. Emily drafted a response, dismantling their claims point by point, reinforcing her case with even more legal precedents. Then, she took the next step. She reached out to the local news, providing them with documents, testimonies, and clear evidence of the HOA's overreach. The story spread faster than I could have imagined. The headline was brutal: Local HOA destroys disabled woman's ramp without warning, legal battle ensues. It was everything the HOA didn't want: public scrutiny, questions from the city, pressure they weren't used to handling. Suddenly, they weren't just fighting Emily in private, they were fighting their own reputation, their entire credibility. And they were losing. I saw Carl the next morning, standing outside his house, his phone pressed to his ear, his expression tight with frustration. He was scrambling, trying to control a narrative that was already slipping away from him. But Emily wasn't done yet. She wasn't just going to win. She was going to dismantle everything they had built, brick by bureaucratic brick. And for the first time, I saw something I had never seen before in Carl's eyes: fear. The fallout from the news story hit harder than I expected. Within hours, the neighborhood was buzzing, not with whispers this time, but with outright conversations. People who had once been too afraid to challenge the HOA were now talking, openly questioning the board's authority. Some were angry at the way they had been manipulated for years, forced to comply with arbitrary rules that served no purpose other than to give Carl and his inner circle more control. Others were simply relieved to see someone finally standing up to them. But the real blow came when a local disability rights organization picked up the story and ran with it, amplifying the outrage beyond our small neighborhood. Social media posts were flooding in, people from outside our community condemning the HOA's actions, legal experts weighing in on the blatant overreach. The HOA wasn't just facing a lawsuit anymore, they were facing public scrutiny on a level they had never imagined. Carl tried to do damage control, but it was too late. The board held an emergency meeting, this time not to enforce a rule or issue another fine, but to figure out how to put out the fire they had started. But the fire was spreading, and fast. The city council received complaints, the county property office began reviewing the HOA's authority, and suddenly, the board members found themselves at the center of an investigation into whether they had illegally enforced policies outside their jurisdiction. They had spent years assuming no one would question them, that they could continue unchecked, making decisions in secret and expecting the community to follow blindly. But now, their entire foundation was cracking under the weight of their own arrogance. Emily wasn't waiting for them to figure out their next move. She was already preparing for the next stage of the fight. She dug deeper into the HOA's financial records, uncovering years of questionable fines and misallocated funds. It turned out that the HOA had been collecting money from homeowners under the guise of maintenance fees, but had done little to actually improve the neighborhood. The funds were being funneled into legal expenses, unnecessary administrative costs, and even personal perks for certain board members. When Emily compiled her findings and sent them to the city's housing commission, it was like throwing gasoline onto an already raging fire. Suddenly, this wasn't just about a ramp. It was about corruption, about a power structure that had been abusing its authority for far too long. The first real sign that the board was unraveling came when one of the members resigned. A woman named Linda, who had always seemed uncomfortable at HOA meetings, stepped down and released a statement to the press. She claimed that she had been pressured into enforcing fines she didn't agree with, that Carl and a few select board members had been making decisions without consulting the rest. It was a betrayal they hadn't expected, and it sent a clear message: the foundation was crumbling. One by one, others started distancing themselves, not wanting to go down with Carl's sinking ship. Homeowners who had once enforced HOA rules with smug certainty were now silent, unsure of where they stood. The power that had once kept everyone in check was slipping through Carl's fingers, and he knew it. The next morning, a cease and desist letter arrived at our doorstep, signed by Carl himself. It was a last-ditch attempt to scare Emily into backing down, claiming she was spreading false accusations and inciting hostility within the neighborhood. The letter was weak, desperate, a sign that he had no real options left. Emily read through it without a flicker of concern before tossing it aside. She didn't even need to respond. The fight had already shifted beyond Carl's control. Then came the final blow. The county property office issued a ruling: Emily's home, along with several others, had never been legally under HOA jurisdiction. Their claim over her property had always been a fabrication, a lie they had used to impose authority where they had none. Every fine, every restriction, every threat they had made over the years was built on nothing but deception. The ruling was a direct hit to Carl's entire regime, and he had no way to fight back. Word spread quickly, and within hours, homeowners were furious. If Emily's property had never been under HOA control, how many others had been paying fines they never actually owed? How many had been bullied into compliance when they never legally had to be? The outrage boiled over, turning into a demand for immediate action. The community called for a vote to remove Carl as HOA president, and this time, no one hesitated. The turnout was massive, more than any meeting in years, and the result was undeniable. Carl was voted out in a landslide. The board collapsed within days, and with it, so did the HOA's stranglehold on the neighborhood. The organization that had ruled with unchecked power was gone, exposed for what it truly was, a self-serving entity that had never been about protecting the community, only controlling it. The night after the vote, I stood outside with Emily, looking at the empty lot where her ramp had once stood. The HOA was gone, but the damage they had done still remained. Without a word, I grabbed a hammer and some wood, and she nodded, understanding immediately. We didn't need permission. We didn't need approval. The rules that had once dictated what could and couldn't exist were meaningless now. We built the ramp back, stronger this time, more permanent. And as we finished, as Emily rolled up and down with ease, testing its strength, I realized something. This fight had never just been about the ramp. It had been about standing up, about pushing back against something that had long gone unchallenged. And in the end, we hadn't just won, we had changed everything. In the days following the collapse of the HOA, the neighborhood felt different. The air was lighter, the tension that had settled over the community for years was finally lifting. It was strange, almost unsettling, how quickly things changed once people realized they had been living under a false authority. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down, avoiding eye contact, were now speaking openly about the ways they had been forced into submission. Some admitted they had been too afraid to question the rules, worried that one wrong step would put them in Carl's crosshairs. Others were just realizing the extent of the manipulation, combing through years of notices, violations, and fees they had paid without ever knowing they were optional. A few even started talking about legal action, wanting refunds for the money they had been wrongly charged, hoping to hold Carl and his remaining supporters accountable. But Carl was gone. He packed up and left within a week, slipping away in the middle of the night like a fugitive, his once pristine home sitting dark and empty. No one knew where he went, and no one really cared. His name became nothing more than a cautionary tale, a bitter memory of what had once ruled this neighborhood. His most loyal followers tried to hold on to the remnants of the HOA, insisting that the community still needed order, structure, guidelines. But without the foundation of fear, their words held no weight. People ignored them, walking away mid-sentence, treating them like relics of an outdated past. They had lost, and nothing they did now could change that. For Emily, the victory was satisfying, but it wasn't enough. She wasn't the type to just win and move on. She wanted to make sure this never happened again, not just to her, but to anyone else who might have been in the same position. She started connecting with other homeowners outside our neighborhood, people in surrounding communities who were also battling power-hungry HOAs. It turned out that our fight was just one of many. Across the county, similar stories were unfolding, homeowners fined into oblivion, people threatened with lawsuits over minor infractions, entire families pushed to the brink by organizations that had far too much power with far too little oversight. The problem was bigger than we had realized, and Emily wasn't about to walk away from it. She began drafting proposals, pushing for legal reform, speaking to city officials about revising the way HOAs were allowed to operate. She wasn't just going after Carl's old empire, she was aiming for the entire system that had allowed people like him to exist in the first place. And people listened. The media continued covering her story, turning her into an unexpected figurehead for homeowners' rights. She was relentless, methodical, the same way she had been when she built her case against our HOA. The difference now was that she had more than just law on her side. She had momentum. She had people. As for me, I watched in awe as my sister took what had once been an act of personal defiance and turned it into something so much bigger. She had never let anything stop her before, not the accident, not the limitations people tried to place on her, and certainly not the overreach of some neighborhood committee that had mistaken itself for a governing body. She was tireless, speaking at community meetings, consulting with lawyers, even getting invited to City Hall to present her findings. She had started this battle with the intent of reclaiming her independence, but now, she was fighting for something greater: justice, fairness, the right for people to live in their own homes without fear of an organization dictating every aspect of their lives. One evening, as we sat on the porch, watching the sunset spill across the sky, she finally exhaled, the weight of the last few months settling on her shoulders. She had done what she set out to do. The HOA was gone. The ramp was back. The people who had once ruled over us had been exposed for what they were, nothing more than bullies who thrived on the silence of others. And now, that silence was broken. The neighborhood didn't just recover, it transformed. People started making changes to their homes without hesitation, painting their fences, planting gardens, reclaiming the spaces they had once been too afraid to personalize. Without the HOA breathing down their necks, they were finally free to exist without judgment, without fines, without threats. For the first time in years, the community felt like an actual neighborhood, not a tightly controlled regime. The night before she left for her first official legal consultation on HOA reform, Emily wheeled herself to the edge of the ramp, pausing for just a second, running her hand over the wood. I knew what she was thinking. This wasn't just a structure. It was proof of everything she had fought for. She looked at me, a small smile on her lips, and I knew this was just the beginning for her. She had torn down one system, but there were so many more left to face. And I had no doubt she would win every single time.